On December 3, 1990, a group of activists traversed the cold rain, piled into a van, parked at the CDC headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia, and forced their way in. These activists sat down and demanded that the CDC change the definition of AIDS. They didn't leave until they were dragged away and carted to jail. This is the story of how the women of ACT UP worked to change the definition of AIDS.
Women die faster, AIDS is a disaster. Women die faster, AIDS is a disaster.
On June 5, 1981, the CDC published an article in its Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report describing cases of a rare lung infection, pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, which was PCP, in 5 young, previously healthy gay men in Los Angeles. Each of the men had other infections, and the researchers noticed that their immune systems weren't working. 2 of the 5 died by the time the report was published, and the 3 others died soon after. This is the first formal scientific report on what we would come to know as acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or AIDS. In the decade that followed, over 100,000 people would die from AIDS and AIDS-related complications, according to the CDC. However, as we'll see, the number was almost certainly far larger because of how the CDC defined HIV or AIDS. After the first detection, researchers identified that the disease spread through gay male communities, leading the public to term it, quote, gay cancer.
A mystery disease known as the gay plague has become an epidemic unprecedented in the history of American medicine. That today from the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta. Topping the list of likely victims are male homosexuals who have many partners and drug users who inject themselves with needles. Medical experts say the disease kills 4 out of every 10 people it strikes and that it threatens to explode in the nation's cities.
From 1982 through 1986, AIDS infections exponentially increased and AIDS became a household name. However, since AIDS predominantly affected gay men, sex workers, IV drug users, and other poor and marginalized populations, activists in the 1980s witnessed a stalled reaction from the government. Then President Ronald Reagan didn't mention HIV or AIDS until 1987, a full 6 years after it had originally been published. Gay activists looked around and realized the government didn't support them, that middle America was afraid of them, and that their friends were rapidly dying. In 1987, after a speech by writer Larry Kramer at the New York Lesbian and Gay Center, a group of activists got together to form ACT UP. ACT UP stands for the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. It was described by Sarah Schulman, a former member and writer, as a, quote, despised group of people with no rights facing a terminal disease for which there were no treatments. ACT UP differed from other AIDS organizations at the time by using radical tactics with an anarchist organizing structure. ACT UP's organizing goal was to use, quote, direct action to end the AIDS crisis. ACT UP's membership was relatively small compared to other AIDS or AIDS affiliate organizations, yet its impact shifted the course of the AIDS epidemic through developing a fast-track system where patients could access experimental drugs, making needle exchanges legal in New York City, ending insurance exclusion for people with AIDS, and many more. ACT UP didn't have a hierarchical structure, no president, no executive board. Instead, each member of ACT UP could join or start committees based on their own interests, ranging from direct actions to media campaigns to policy development. ACT UP's membership was primarily white gay men and women, with small sections of men and women of color. This was because the AIDS crisis was considered a, quote, gay disease, with mainstream outlets mapping AIDS onto homosexuality as a punishment for sexual deviance. Author Deborah B. Gould argues that this deviance was co-opted and transformed by ACT UP as a site of world-making. ACT UP didn't just react to the AIDS crisis, but imagined new worlds and ways to format institutions beyond what already was. Gould argues that ACT UP helped develop a new queer sensibility that didn't shy away from the harsh, the erotic, or the confrontational. ACT UP radicalized its members by exposing the ways institutions like the CDC, the NIH, and the FDA were designed to exclude and oppress. In 1987, AIDS was defined in one of two ways. You could either get a positive test result from a blood test, or you had to present with one or more conditions called opportunistic infections. This could include things like oral thrush, Kaposi sarcoma, which were round spots showing up on your skin, or herpes simplex virus. Since blood tests weren't widely available, opportunistic infections were a major way to diagnose AIDS. Having an AIDS diagnosis was especially important for patients in poverty, as diagnoses help patients get access to social services like Medicaid and Social Security. However, women AIDS activists began noticing there was little to no research available for women with AIDS. Rebecca Cole, volunteer for the National AIDS Hotline, discovered that since 1969, there were almost no clinical trials done on women, period, for any drugs. That was because in 1969, pregnant women were given a drug called thalidomide for morning sickness and ended up giving birth to disabled babies and babies missing arms and legs. After this incident, drug companies didn't want to take on the risk of potential harm to fetuses and stopped including women in experimental drug trials. Therefore, drugs being tested for HIV and AIDS weren't being tested on women either. Additionally, women were excluded from clinical trials studying the manifestations of opportunistic infections from HIV and AIDS. Therefore, a lot of symptoms women were experiencing, like vaginal thrush, pelvic inflammatory disease, and cervical cancer, weren't listed in the 1987 AIDS definition. Women were also left out of risk groups defined by the CDC, who emphasized that homosexual men, bisexual men, and IV drug users were at greater risk. Women were wholly left out of studies, left out of risk groups, and left out of the definition. While working in New York City as a housing lawyer for people in poverty, Terry McGovern realized that a lot of her clients presented with HIV symptoms. Because of stigma, Terry opened the HIV Law Project to help low-income people with AIDS get access to housing and social services. However, her clients couldn't access Medicaid or Social Security without an AIDS diagnosis. So Terry, along with other members of ACT UP, decided to do something about it.
Most women who are living with AIDS are Black, Hispanic, or they are poor. So they are in need of city services. And to get city services, you need an AIDS diagnosis. And that is a problem because a lot of women are diagnosed as having ARC and never move on to AIDS. And that's kind of what I'm going to talk about, are the reasons why they're always lumped in the ARC category and don't have an AIDS diagnosis.
Arguably, the longest campaign that ACT UP ever committed to was the campaign to change the CDC's definition of AIDS. Sarah Schulman describes this campaign as, quote, messy because the women fighting to be included in the CDC's definition were not connected to pharmaceutical companies and didn't work for government agencies like a lot of their gay male counterparts. A lot of lesbians and women with AIDS were incarcerated or poor. Many women with AIDS were women of color. Some of the women working in ACT UP didn't have AIDS, but were lesbians and in community with AIDS patients. Each woman had a different personality and used different tactics, throwing everything they had at the problem because the times were so desperate. People were dying all around them, women included. These women found friction at every level, including within ACT UP. Some of the men in ACT UP wanted to focus more on expanding research for gay men and were less concerned with getting women included. Despite this, the women of ACT UP continued to develop strategies to push for inclusion and found male allies to help them. Incarcerated women with AIDS, like Katrina Haslip, began educational programs in Bedford Hills Prison to educate fellow inmates on HIV and provide support for them. Haslip, Judy Clark, and former Weatherman Underground member Kathy Boudin founded AIDS Counseling and Education, or ACE.
I'm here because I'm an ex-prisoner, and I'm also HIV infected, and I learned that status while being confined. And because I want adequate health care for prisoners that I left there, and it shouldn't be a death sentence that they have HIV. I don't want them harassed or isolated as a result of that. I want education for them, peer education, which includes condom distribution and dental dam distribution. I want Cuomo to acknowledge that he needs that there and to provide it for them, because the prisoners themselves are taking the initiative to try to change things and are being harassed and penalized as a result of that. I want them to let out terminally ill individuals due to HIV, because that's like double jeopardy, and it becomes a death sentence for those individuals. And if they pose no threat to society, let them out and let them die in dignity in hospitals or in the community that they belong to. And I want them to acknowledge that and to change that. So that's why I'm here.
The ACT UP New York Women's Committee held teach-ins explaining where the research was, how to prevent AIDS through sexual transmission, and critiquing institutions like the CDC and NIH for limited research. The committee also published Women, AIDS, and Activism, detailing information they explained at teach-ins so it could be distributed widely. ACT UP members started doing direct actions. They picketed outside the Social Security building to get them to stop using the CDC definition of age to reject applicants. They protested at the Department of Health and Human Services. They protested outside of the CDC building. They pressured the NIH to do a conference on women and AIDS. They began targeting the head of the CDC, James Curran, with letters, postcards, and they even followed him around as he traveled the country for business. They showed up at his hotel, and they demanded that he change the definition. Members of ACT UP got a meeting with CDC representatives where members from ACT UP New York and ACT UP Atlanta presented their research to the CDC. When this meeting failed, ACT UP members decided to occupy the CDC building.
Murder by omission! Change the definition! Murder by omission! Change the definition!
Like that. Say that.
We don't know.
I'm reading the fiscal year 1991 HIV budget initiatives.
They give y'all a bad name. Yeah.
Nice shot.
Goodbye! Bye!
Change the definition! Act up! Fight back! Fight AIDS! Act up! Fight back! Fight AIDS!
ACT UP members from New York and Atlanta started the day at Emory University, speaking in classrooms and protesting down the streets of the school. In the cold, pouring rain, a group piled in a van, drove to the CDC headquarters, and forced themselves into the building to demand that Gary Noble, the deputy of HIV at the CDC, change the definition of AIDS. When they entered the building, they realized Noble wasn't there. But they still occupied his office and demonstrated, demanding that the CDC change the definition. They sat on the floor, they held hands, they did demonstrations, they dressed up, they took pictures so that it could be widely distributed to the media. They looked at important documents regarding AIDS and AIDS research. And eventually, over 100 people were arrested after being dragged into police buses from the CDC building. And finally, after all their protesting and meeting and speaking, the CDC finally did nothing. In 1991, the CDC still hadn't changed the definition. So ACT UP didn't stop.
So after that, they thought that that was it and that they would sort of like, we would give up. And I think this was what was really important. We just kept going. And we didn't just do direct action after that. We did a lot of small things. So we started we monitored what they were doing, and every time they tried to change the CDC definition and not put in women's stuff, we would do something. And we did things like, because we had this mailing list now from all over the country, so we would like send out an alert, okay? James Curran is trying to change the CDC definition. He's not putting in any of the women's infection. Write to your senator, call your congressperson, tell them you're demanding a congressional investigation of the Centers for Disease Control. Boom, he would stop, okay? Then he'd try again. I mean, they tried at the CDC 3 or 4 times in the next 2 years to change the definition to what they wanted it to be, which was basically 200 T cells. Okay, and no specificity of women's infections or the infections that drug users got at all. Okay, and the main reason that people supported the 200 T cells is because there were a lot of healthcare providers who were seeing people with those T cells who were not considered to have HIV because they didn't have the infections that were on the list, and so they weren't getting reimbursed from the government. So they wanted the 200 T cells, and they didn't care about the rest of it.
It took over 4 years of consistent pressure for the CDC to change its definition of AIDS. It took the occupation of multiple buildings, actions in New York, Atlanta, Bethesda, Maryland, San Francisco. It took participation not just from women, but also from men. It took the interest of other organizations like the Gay Men's Health Crisis and the ACLU. But ultimately, it took years of long work from women like Katrina Haslip, Maxine Wolf, and Terry McGovern. In 1993, the CDC finally revised the definition to include pulmonary tuberculosis, recurrent pneumonia, and invasive cervical cancer, while opening up the definition to include anyone with a T-cell count below 200. This expanded definition included significantly more women, especially women of color and poor women. 1993 also marked the establishment of the Women's Interagency HIV Study, the first major federally funded study on women and AIDS. This study happened over a decade after HIV and AIDS shows up in the research. Sarah Schulman argues that this victory proves that women of color, gay women, poor women, and other marginalized women could win against predominantly white male power structures. But they had to fight longer and harder. They had to do more direct actions. They had to create more grassroots coalitions. This fight was long, it was hard, and it was deadly. Many women with AIDS fighting for their inclusion through ACT UP died before the definition changed, including Katrina Haslip. She died just 1 month before the definition changed. These women's commitment still affects women with HIV today. Every drug trial that included women of color is still a drug used internationally to treat HIV and AIDS. The women of ACT UP didn't just react to the AIDS crisis. They made space for themselves and others, developing new queer sensibilities and pushing beyond their predetermined societal roles. At every level, from within the organization to contending with the CDC and FDA, the women of ACT UP worked consistently, diligently, and relentlessly. They had multiple strategies. In Lisa Levinstein's book, They Didn't See Us Coming, The Hidden History of Feminism in the 90s, she describes successful strategies of feminist organizations as multiple, varied, and operating at every level, from local to global. ACT UP shows us that this everything in the kitchen sink strategy can work. It requires dedicated people talking across difference, working together for a common cause. These women didn't have power or privilege compared to their white gay co-members, but they had tenacity. They had manpower, and over time they built a coalition that shifted the conversation to include women, not just in the AIDS conversation, but in the research and in the definition.
Give me one reason to stay here, and I'll turn right back around. Give me one reason to stay here, and I'll turn right back around. Said I don't wanna leave you lonely. You gotta make me change my mind. Baby, I got your number. Oh, and I know that you got mine. You know that I called you. I called too many times. You can call me, baby. You can call me anytime. You got to call me.